White police officer confronts black judge, claims he stole the car he was driving. In the bustling heart of Detroit, a single moment on a busy street spirals into a storm of accusation, outrage, and reckoning. A white police officer pulls over a sleek, black sedan, certain the driver has stolen it. Except the driver is a black judge, returning from a long day in court. Tensions spike in an instant, drawing city-wide attention and igniting smoldering embers of prejudice that threaten to blaze out of control. As hidden histories unravel and loyalties shatter, both the officer and the judge hurtle toward a showdown that challenges faith in the law itself. Prepare for a journey of betrayal, revelation, and hard-earned karma. It was a chilly autumn evening in Detroit. The sun had dipped below the skyline of tall office buildings and warehouses, leaving the city awash in golden twilight. Judge Jamal Carter was driving home after a grueling day, presiding over cases at the Frank Murphy Hall of Justice, a real and storied courthouse known for its docket of high-profile criminal proceedings. He had just wrapped up a 6-week homicide trial, and the tension had followed him to his chambers and clung to him like an unwelcome shadow. Judge Carter's vehicle was a gleaming black Mercedes-Benz, a recent purchase symbolizing the years of hard work and diligence he had invested in his career. He rarely drove it himself most days. An assigned driver from the court staff handled transportation, but tonight he wanted solitude. The hum of the engine and the subtle orchestration of jazz from the radio soothed him as he traveled through the city's busy streets. Near the intersection of Woodward Avenue and Grand Boulevard, the traffic was stop and go. On normal days, this part of Detroit was alive with the chatter of people leaving work, street vendors peddling snacks, and bright marquee lights of restored theaters. Tonight, a hush had fallen over the streets, broken only by honking cars and hurried footsteps of pedestrians rushing to find warmth indoors. Judge Carter spotted a group of children waiting at a crosswalk, pulling their thin coats tighter around themselves. The bright neon sign of a nearby Coney Island diner reflected off his car's hood. He thought about the trial that had concluded earlier that afternoon. A teenage defendant, a complicated murder case, tense testimony that indicated systemic failures in foster care. The threads of poverty, neglect, and desperation had woven themselves into every aspect of that courtroom drama. As the gavel had come down, setting a date for sentencing, Judge Carter couldn't shake the feeling that a cycle was continuing rather than ending. He'd grown up in a rough Detroit neighborhood, faced the same socioeconomic pitfalls that haunted many youths, yet he'd somehow made it out. His father, once a mechanic at Ford Motor Company, had drilled into him the importance of law and order. Ironically, while raising him in an environment bristling with racial tensions. The judge prided himself on fairness, believing that the system could be used as a tool for justice, not a weapon of oppression. Just as he turned onto a quieter side street to avoid construction, bright blue and red lights blinked to life in his rearview mirror. At first, Judge Carter felt an ambiguous twist in his gut. Why was he being pulled over? He knew he had not run a red light. He'd been at a complete stop before turning. No speed limit violation. Either the congested road wouldn't allow more than 10 miles per hour. Perhaps a broken tail light. He briefly recalled dropping his phone on the passenger seat earlier. Maybe the officer had mistaken that movement for something else. He sighed, pulled the Mercedes over to the curb, and turned off the engine. Through the mirror, he saw a tall, broad-shouldered officer step out of the squad car. Even in the dim light, he caught a glimpse of the officer's pale face, set with an intense frown. This wasn't Carter's first time being pulled over. He was a black man in America, after all. Despite his revered position as a judge, he was no stranger to these roadside interactions that could be tense, unnerving, and unpredictable. Determined to stay composed, He rolled down the window and rested both hands on the steering wheel, clearly visible. The officer approached, his hand near the holster of his firearm. His posture exuded suspicion and authority. Judge Carter didn't know him personally. Detroit's police force was huge, and Carter mostly interacted with higher-ranking officials or those testifying in court. Maybe the officer was new or from a different precinct. The name tag read Hughes. Driver's license and registration, Officer Hughes demanded brusquely, skipping any polite introduction. There was a hardness in his eyes. Certainly, officer, Judge Carter replied evenly. He moved slowly, opening his glove compartment. He withdrew his registration papers, then retrieved his driver's license from his wallet. He knew the routine, no sudden movements. Keep calm. Here you go. Officer Hughes eyed the documents with a skeptical glare before leaning in closer. Sir, do you know why I pulled you over? Actually, I don't, Carter replied, maintaining an even tone. He prided himself on staying composed under pressure, occupational training that had become second nature. The policeman ignored the remark for a moment, flipping through the documents. His stare lingered on Judge Carter. Then, in a voice dripping with condescension, he said, "Is this car yours?" Judge Carter blinked, momentarily thrown off. "Yes, I purchased it a few months ago. My name's on the registration." Hughes didn't even glance at the papers. Instead, his brow furrowed. "Well, we got a report about a black Mercedes matching this description. Possible stolen vehicle. Just because you printed a name on a piece of paper doesn't make it legitimate." In that instant, something in Carter's chest clenched. 1,000 thoughts raced at once about the way a routine traffic stop can escalate, about how many times good people had been pegged as criminals purely on the basis of skin color, about how ironically precarious it was that he, a sitting judge, was being challenged over a legitimate vehicle. He felt an old, familiar ache, the kind he'd felt growing up, that suspicion, that assumption of guilt before innocence. For a second, a flicker of anger crossed Carter's face, but he reined it in. Calmly, he asked, "Officer Hughes, would you mind reading the registration? You'll see the VIN matches the car, and the name is indeed mine, Judge Jamal Carter." The officer bristled. "I don't care what you claim to be, or who. It's not the first time someone used a fake ID to pass themselves off as someone else." "Step out of the vehicle." Carter felt the tension ratchet up. He wasn't above the law. He'd proven that in countless rulings. But something about this officer's approach was off more than just standard procedure. The cynicism, the aggression, and the absolute refusal to believe him at face value. He recognized the pattern all too well. Nodding, Carter carefully unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out, making sure to keep his hands visible. Another officer, presumably Hughes's partner, had also stepped out of the squad car, though he lingered near the trunk, eyeing the scene warily. Carter found himself pressed against the Mercedes, the shimmering paint cool against his suit jacket. Officer Hughes began patting him down, ignoring Carter's attempts to hand back the documents. "Spread your legs," Hughes barked. "Hands on the hood." The impact of those words, delivered in that icy tone, felt more humiliating than Carter cared to admit. Just a few hours ago, he'd been in a courtroom dealing with motions, deliberations, and the final verdict. Now, he was being treated like a common criminal. He inhaled slowly, forcing down the storm brewing inside. Suddenly, the radio on Officer Hughes' shoulder crackled. A dispatcher's voice. "Unit 27, be advised. The stolen Mercedes report was a false alarm. Plates don't match." "Repeat, the Mercedes is not stolen." Hughes tensed, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Stay out of this," he snapped into the radio before letting go. The humiliation in the air was palpable, but he didn't step back. Instead, he pressed Carter harder against the hood, rummaging in his pockets as though expecting to find contraband. Carter clenched his jaw. "Officer, you heard your dispatcher. The car isn't stolen. Hughes grabbed Carter by the shoulder. "Keep your mouth shut," he hissed. Then, as though realizing how precarious this was, he stepped back. Carter turned slowly, feeling a wave of relief, but also deep anger. The officer's partner ventured a few steps forward, looking uncertain, as though he'd just realized this was spiraling into a bigger problem. Adjusting his uniform, Officer Hughes cleared his throat. "I still have reason to believe something's off." He pointed at the car. "Can't trust all that fancy paperwork, especially not with stolen identities floating around." A fierce swirl of indignation twisted inside Carter, but he held firm. "You know what, Officer Hughes? Let's do this by the book. Run my license, check the registration with the DMV, verify the VIN on your system. You'll find everything is legitimate." Hughes stared him down. Time seemed to suspend. The officer opened his mouth, as if to retaliate, but the voice on his radio broke in again, this time more assertive. "Unit 27, immediate request for response. Did you copy the stolen vehicle update? Please confirm. Over." Without taking his eyes off Carter, Hughes pressed the button on his shoulder. "Copy," he muttered. Then he turned away, leaving Carter standing by his Mercedes. The officer's partner exchanged a brief, uneasy glance with Carter, as though trying to convey some unspoken apology or confusion. By now, a few passers-by had paused to watch the scene. But Detroit is a big city. People have their own lives, their own stories of police encounters. After a few moments of quiet scrutiny, they moved on. Carter noticed one bystander filming on a smartphone from across the street, carefully angled behind a nearby parked car. The lens glinted in the streetlight. Officer Hughes lowered his radio. "We're not done here," he said stiffly. "I'm going to call this in again. You wait." Judge Carter nodded, though everything inside him wanted to scream at the injustice. This was a direct assault on his dignity, yet he found a small sliver of solace. If this was how a judge was being treated, how must everyday black citizens feel in these encounters? How many times had Carter heard stories on the bench or in private about exactly this scenario, and how many times had he, from a place of privilege, believed he could help fix the system from within? As he watched Officer Hughes stalk back to the patrol car, Carter quietly vowed that this injustice wouldn't be buried, not tonight. And thus began the chain of events that would explode into public consciousness, entangling the police, the courts, and the entire community in a scandal that reeked of bias, power, and unspoken history. Long before he became the Honorable Jamal Carter, he was simply Jamal from Detroit's West Side. The Carters lived in a cramped two-bedroom apartment near Joy Road, a place known for boarded-up storefronts, loud stoops, and graffiti-splashed walls. Poverty was pervasive, but even as a child, Jamal sensed that the city's beating heart offered possibility amidst the struggle. His father, William Carter, was a mechanic at Ford's Rouge complex. At home, William was silent more often than not, his face etched by exhaustion after hours beneath the chassis of trucks and cars. Jamal's mother, Rosa, worked part-time as a nurse's aide at a local clinic. They adored their only son, pushing him to excel in school. Education, they preached, was the key to unlocking a better future. By the time Jamal was in middle school, he'd witnessed the cyclical nature of criminal activity in his neighborhood. Police cruisers were a common sight, either racing to a reported crime scene or slowly rolling through the block to keep a watchful eye. Jamal often watched from the window as young men he played basketball with would be patted down or questioned for no apparent reason. On a few occasions, he saw altercations escalate to arrests that struck him as unjust. A seed of anger began to grow within him, anger at the system, but also confusion. If these officers were sworn to protect, why did so many of his friends feel threatened by them? By high school, Jamal had channeled his frustrations into academics. He became fascinated by the Point-Us Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the court's role in interpreting them. It was around his sophomore year that he met someone who would change the course of his life, Judge Henry Olmsted, a visiting speaker at a citywide youth program. Judge Olmsted was an older man with thinning grey hair who spoke passionately about justice and equality. Jamal, enthralled, asked him how a kid from Detroit's West Side could possibly become a judge. Olmsted's response: "Work harder than everyone else, and never forget where you came from." That moment crystallized Jamal's ambition. He'd go on to earn a full scholarship to Michigan State University, then attend Wayne State University Law School. Through each step, he pushed forward with unwavering determination. His parents, though not highly educated, supported him. He clerked for the Michigan Court of Appeals, soaking in every lesson on due process, legal precedent, and the delicate balance between law and compassion. Eventually, after years in private practice and then a stint in the district attorney's office, he campaigned for a seat on the judicial bench. Judge Carter quickly gained a reputation for fairness. Colleagues admired his objectivity and fairness. Defendants appreciated that he listened. Prosecutors respected his no-nonsense rulings. Even defense attorneys, often at odds with the bench, admitted that Carter was open-minded and thorough. Behind the robes, though, was still that boy from Joy Road who recalled the sting of being targeted, the yearning for a better system. So when Officer Hughes dismissed him with scorn, ignoring his credentials and the law, it wasn't just a personal affront, it was an attack on everything Carter stood for. He had dedicated his life to upholding justice, only to be reduced to a suspect with no probable cause. Standing on that Detroit street, pressed against his own Mercedes, Carter felt an old anger rising, the kind that had once fueled his quest to fix the system. He'd encountered small moments of bias before, but never so blatant, never so humiliating. He also felt something else, a flash of embarrassment. He was aware that if any cameras caught this moment, it would be big news. A black judge harassed by a white officer. The city had been simmering with racial tension for years, like a pot on slow boil. One mishandled spark, one viral video, could ignite a conflagration. Carter reminded himself of who he was, of the oath he took, not to let personal feelings cloud his better judgment. Still, that night, as he recalled the humiliating search and the officer's sneering voice, he let himself feel the pang of wounded dignity. The law was only as strong as its enforcers and guardians, and tonight the law felt pitifully weak. Officer Michael Hughes hailed from the suburbs of Grand Rapids, Michigan. Growing up in a predominantly white neighborhood, he had minimal direct interaction with people of color in his formative years. His father, Robert Hughes, was a retired Marine-turned-security consultant who taught Michael to be tough, diligent, and always ready to see potential threats in the everyday. Michael's childhood revolved around discipline. He woke at 5 a.m. for drills in the backyard, followed by daily chores and a stringent study schedule. There was little room for emotional expression or negotiation. It was a life built on yes sir, no sir responses, forged by the unwavering authority of his father. Robert took pride in raising a boy who wouldn't hesitate in the face of adversity, a boy who believed that lawlessness was the root of societal decline. When Michael decided to join the police force, it felt like a natural extension of his upbringing. However, the rigid black and white worldview instilled in him left little room for understanding the nuanced realities of living in a racially diverse city like Detroit. He went through academy training, excelled in marksmanship and physical tests, and entered service at the Detroit Police Department. Initially, he served in quieter precincts, but a departmental transfer placed him in a more volatile district. Over time, his approach became more hardened. The stress of patrolling high-crime neighborhoods, along with encountering frequent hostility, confirmed his deeply embedded assumption you had to be tough to survive. If he sensed attitude from suspects, he doubled down on dominance, believing it was the only way to maintain control. He rarely sought to understand the broader context of poverty, systemic inequality, or historical trauma that might drive crime rates. To him, the line between good guys and bad guys was bright and uncompromising. Eventually, complaints trickled in allegations of excessive force or racially charged remarks. But police unions are formidable, and the complaints, lacking robust evidence, found themselves lost in bureaucratic swirl. He was never disciplined beyond a perfunctory slap on the wrist. Michael Hughes, emboldened, believed he was simply doing his duty. Then came the night he spotted a black Mercedes rolling through a Detroit neighborhood he deemed too high-end for most. Hughes had been on the lookout for a stolen vehicle, sure, but also, in his mind, the occupant of that Mercedes was suspicious. A mixture of cynicism, prejudice, and adrenaline overcame him. By the time he learned the driver was a sitting judge, it was too late. He'd already committed himself to the assumption that something shady was going on. Pride wouldn't let him back down easily. And so, in front of onlookers, with cameras rolling from the shadows, he pressed a black judge against the hood of a car that was, in fact, not stolen. What might have been a minor embarrassment for any other citizen became an explosive incident with the potential to reverberate far beyond that street. In the back of his mind, Hughes knew he'd crossed a line that night, but fear and anger can be potent forces. What if the department found out just how far he'd gone? Could he lose his job, his pension, everything he'd built? What about his father's disappointment if he discovered Michael had allowed a suspect judge or not to outsmart or humiliate him? The seeds of desperation were planted, and he resolved to protect himself at all costs. The night of the stop, Judge Carter eventually drove away, but not before Officer Hughes issued him a written warning pending further investigation, a hollow threat that left Carter seething. The entire altercation, Carter feared, was a harbinger of something bigger, yet he didn't want to storm into the precinct that same night, rage in tow. He needed to cool down, gather his thoughts, and approach the matter methodically. Returning to his apartment, he found no solace. His downtown loft felt cold and impersonal after the stress he'd just endured. Sleep was elusive. Images of the police lights, the officer's stern face, the press of metal against his body kept flashing through his mind. By dawn, he resolved to file an official complaint. After all, the Detroit Police Department, under public pressure, had started to modernize their review process. Complaints could be submitted through the Office of the Chief Investigator, an independent arm designed to ensure accountability. Carter's standing as a judge might expedite or complicate the matter, but he refused to let that deter him. That morning, local news outlets were already buzzing. A phone-recorded video began circulating on social media, grainy but damning. One of the bystanders had captured the moment Hughes threw Carter against the hood, ignoring the radio dispatcher's insistence that the vehicle was legitimate. The clip was short, but it sparked a storm of online commentary, typical example of racial profiling. A judge? Seriously? Detroit PD needs to clean house, stop making everything about race. The cop was probably just doing his job. How many times does this happen to those without the power of a judge? Within hours, the story reached local television stations. They covered it with a degree of sensationalism that turned Carter's humiliating moment into an explosive scandal. By midday, #JusticeForJudgeCarter was trending on Twitter. Civil rights groups called for a full investigation. The Detroit police commissioner, cornered by the press in a hastily arranged interview, promised an impartial and thorough internal review. As for Officer Hughes, he walked into the station that morning to an atmosphere that felt charged. Some colleagues gave him wide-eyed looks. Others avoided him altogether. Word had spread that he messed with the wrong person. His immediate superior, Sergeant Langston, summoned him into a private office. On the desk sat a manila folder and a smartphone. The damning video paused at the frame where Carter was pinned against the car. "Care to explain this?" Langston asked quietly. Hughes swallowed, counting on the usual procedural dance. "I was acting on a report of a stolen Mercedes." The suspect matched the description. "I followed protocol." "Protocol?" The sergeant's brow arched. "You ignored dispatch. On camera, no less. You do realize that, right?" Hughes fidgeted. He felt cornered, a sensation he despised. "With all due respect, Sergeant," the dispatch was confused. "Stolen vehicles are common out here, and the suspect was being uncooperative." The sergeant exhaled. "Uncooperative? The man's a respected judge, and the dispatcher specifically told you the plates didn't match the stolen car. You were told in real time to stand down. Didn't you hear that?" Michael stared at the paused video. He saw himself pinning Carter, a scowl across his own face. Out of context, it looked brutal. Even in context, it was questionable. I might not have heard clearly," he lied. "Traffic noise, the radio crackling." It was chaotic. Sergeant Langston drummed his fingers on the desk. "Look, the department is under the microscope here. We can't afford to be sloppy, especially with someone as high profile as Judge Carter. There's going to be an official internal investigation. In the meantime, you're on desk duty." Desk duty was a blow to Hughes's pride, but the sergeant's tone made it clear there was no room for negotiation. Michael nodded stiffly and left the office. As he walked the halls, he caught murmurs, fragments of conversations about the judge fiasco. His face burned. He knew he had to act quickly to shape the narrative before it shaped him. Maybe he could claim confusion or procedural error, perhaps even cast doubt on the judge's behavior. Something, anything to deflect blame. By the next day, the wheels of bureaucracy ground into action. Judge Carter had met with his attorney, a trusted friend from law school named Michelle Grant. She was a formidable civil rights lawyer who believed wholeheartedly in Carter's integrity. She insisted on filing a civil complaint and supporting any departmental investigation. Carter was initially hesitant. Part of him worried that pressing charges would intensify the media spectacle and threaten the impartiality of future cases he presided over. Michelle was unyielding. "If they can do this to you, a judge, imagine what they do to everyone else who can't fight back. You can't stay silent." So Carter agreed, drafting a statement for the press in which he condemned racial profiling without painting the entire police force with a broad brush. He was careful, methodical, just as he was in the courtroom. He demanded an internal review and public accountability, not sensational punishment. But the press ran with the more incendiary headlines anyway. Judge Carter launches accusations of racial profiling. Meanwhile, local politicians began to weigh in. City council members demanded to know how a high-ranking city official could be treated so brazenly. Protesters gathered outside the police station, holding signs that read "Protect and serve, not profile," and "Subjugate." A few community leaders called for calm, urging the public to let the investigation run its course. Others saw this as a rallying cry for broader reforms, including mandatory body cams for all officers, bias training, and further oversight. Hughes, stuck at a desk, felt his world crashing. Each day, the media churned out fresh angles. What does this say about Detroit's police culture? Is this an isolated incident or a systemic issue? He recognized that he was now the poster boy for everything people considered wrong with policing. And ironically, the more he tried to hide from it, the more it dogged him. Fear began gnawing at him too. If the internal review found him guilty of misconduct, he could be suspended or even fired. If a civil suit followed and he lost, the financial ramifications would be enormous. His father's stern face swam before his eyes, reminding Michael of how deeply shame was woven into the family code. He decided he needed allies, someone to help him spin his version of the story. Thus, he reached out to the local union rep, who in turn connected him with an attorney specializing in defending officers in misconduct cases. The attorney, David Kingsley, was known for his bulldog tactics, discrediting accusers, finding procedural loopholes. Kingsley met with Hughes one evening in a small coffee shop off Jefferson Avenue. The lawyer's pinstriped suit contrasted with the dingy tables and chipped mugs around them. "You say you smelled marijuana or something else that gave you probable cause?" Kingsley asked in a low voice. Hughes blinked. "No," he replied. "That never came up." "Well, how about we say the judge was acting erratically, reaching for his glove compartment repeatedly, ignoring your instructions?" The lawyer took a sip of coffee. "We just need a plausible reason you acted in good faith." Hughes felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Fabricating details like that could be risky, but in the same breath, he recognized that if he didn't craft a narrative, he risked losing everything. "I might be able to say he was rummaging around." "Yes," Hughes ventured. Kingsley's eyes gleamed, a hint of opportunism shining through. "Good, because then we can argue you had a genuine fear for your safety. The law gives officers wide latitude in uncertain situations. A high-crime neighborhood, suspicious movement from the driver, confusion about the stolen car notice. All of that can be shaped into a defense. I'll also highlight your record commendations, awards, any community service. We'll bury the complaints as unsubstantiated. Understand?" Unease settled over Hughes. He wasn't entirely comfortable with lying outright, but desperation had a way of eroding moral boundaries. The fear of public shaming, job loss, and potential financial ruin overshadowed any concern for ethics. "I understand," he said quietly. While official investigations churned, the streets of Detroit became a public forum for debate. The city was no stranger to protests around policing. In neighborhoods from the east side to the west side, groups gathered to share stories of racial profiling, to vent frustration, or to advocate for more resources for the police so they could effectively serve the community without suspicion overshadowing every interaction. Judge Carter, though revered in legal circles, was still a somewhat distant figure to the average Detroiter. This incident changed that overnight. People who had never set foot in a courtroom now saw him as a symbol of a broken system. Some praised him for shedding light on an issue that so many faced daily but rarely saw justice for. Others, more cynical, grumbled that Carter's prominence would guarantee him justice that ordinary folks might never see. A few believed the entire story was blown out of proportion, that it was another round of cops being demonized. Social media thrummed with both support and vitriol. A local civil rights organization, Detroit People's Justice, organized a rally one Saturday afternoon outside the Frank Murphy Hall of Justice. Signs soared in the crisp autumn air. "Racial profiling stops here. We demand accountability. And is driving while black a crime?" The group's leader, Harriet Daniels, a fiery community organizer, led chants and gave impassioned speeches. Judge Carter, out of respect for judicial ethics, avoided direct participation in any protest. But Michelle Grant, his attorney, made an appearance. "Judge Carter seeks the same thing you all seek, a fair investigation," Michelle told the crowd. Cameras zoomed in as she spoke. He stands with the community in calling for transparency and equality under the law. In a smaller demonstration, a few blocks away, a pro-police rally gathered. People held Blue Lives Matter flags and placards, urging the city not to punish the entire force for one alleged mistake. A few even suggested Carter was playing the race card, a phrase that stung supporters of the judge. Tensions simmered as the two groups occasionally crossed paths, though no major violence was reported that day. Carter himself watched footage of the rallies on television from his office. He felt a storm inside him, gratitude for the support, empathy for those who saw him as a representative for their own struggles, and frustration that the issue was dividing the city he loved. This was never about pitting the community against the police. He wanted justice done, accountability served, but the narrative had spiraled beyond his control. Weeks into the investigation, new details emerged that shifted the public perception yet again. Internal memos leaked from the police department indicated that Officer Hughes had multiple unresolved complaints of racial bias in traffic stops. None were conclusive, mostly because the complainants lacked resources or gave up mid-process. This new revelation rattled the police department's leadership, fueling suspicion that the problem was deeper than a single bad stop. Simultaneously, rumors swirled that certain city council members had known about these complaints, but did nothing to avoid conflict with the powerful police union. The local news ran a series of investigative pieces, culminating in a bombshell. A whistleblower within the department leaked bodycam footage from a few months prior, showing Hughes making disparaging remarks about a Hispanic family at a traffic stop. The camera angled upward, capturing the officer's face contorted in anger, spewing profanity, laced insults that suggested a pattern of racial bias. The outcry was immediate. Protesters demanded his immediate termination. The department, which had previously kept bodycam footage under wraps citing ongoing investigations, was forced to confirm the video's authenticity. Under mounting scrutiny, they placed Hughes on indefinite suspension, pending a formal hearing. Even the union distanced itself publicly, though behind closed doors it continued to weigh legal strategies to protect one of its own. All of this heightened the tension in Officer Hughes's life. The unstoppable train of condemnation roared toward him. He called David Kingsley frantically, desperate for a plan. "They have more evidence, old footage." "I didn't know it existed," he stammered over the phone. Kingsley remained coldly professional. "It complicates our defense, but not necessarily dooms it. We argue that the old footage is taken out of context. Your statements were misheard, or you were under extreme stress. We highlight how it's not directly related to the judge's incident." Hughes sighed, realizing this was a losing battle. The cumulative effect of the new revelations was destroying his credibility. He felt cornered. In the hush of his small apartment, he reflected on the path that led him here, on the sense of moral certainty he once had. But introspection was painful, and he quickly pushed those thoughts away. Meanwhile, Judge Carter's phone rang non-stop. Interviews, invitations to speak at community forums, requests to weigh in on broader policing issues. He turned most of them down, wanting to maintain judicial neutrality. Michelle Grant, however, seized the moment to push for institutional reforms. She joined forces with community leaders, drafting proposals for mandatory bias training, increased oversight, and a clear disciplinary process for officers who had repeated complaints of misconduct. Some city officials were initially resistant, but public demand grew too loud to ignore. Behind the scenes, Carter wrestled with his own conscience. He'd always believed in due process, the notion that an accused individual, yes, even Officer Hughes, deserved a fair hearing. But the judge in him also recognized that the evidence was mounting in a damning pattern. This wasn't an isolated case of a good cop having a bad day. This was about a culture that had allowed such behavior to fester. The deeper question was how to fix it without alienating the many good officers who did serve honorably. As tensions reached a boiling point, the department scheduled a public disciplinary hearing for Hughes. It was an unprecedented move designed to restore public trust. The hearing would be overseen by an external review board, including city officials, police representatives, and civilian members. On the day of the hearing, media vans lined the street outside the police headquarters. Protesters on both sides, some holding signs proclaiming Hughes' innocence, others demanding his badge, created a cacophony of chants. Judge Carter arrived as a witness, accompanied by Michelle Grant. He wore a somber expression, determined to remain calm. His presence electrified the crowd. The hearing room was packed. Hughes sat at a table with David Kingsley by his side, sporting a crisp suit that tried to mask the anxiety etched on his face. Carter was seated near the front, ready to testify about his experience. The board members, an eclectic group of 5, settled in behind a long wooden table, the emblem of the Detroit Police Department emblazoned on the wall behind them. Kingsley launched into an aggressive opening statement, painting Hughes as a dedicated officer caught in a miscommunication that night, and the old body cam footage as an attempt to impugn his character with out-of-context remarks. Kingsley accused the department of bowing to political correctness and media sensationalism. He insisted that Carter had indeed acted suspiciously, rummaging in the car, giving the officer reason to fear a hidden weapon. Then came Carter's testimony. The usually unflappable judge felt a quiver in his chest as he recalled the humiliating moments. He recounted everything calmly, emphasizing that he'd followed every instruction and that the dispatcher's radio call had clearly stated the car was not stolen. Kingsley tried to poke holes in Carter's account, suggesting Carter was arrogant, playing the "do you know who I am" card. Carter shook his head. At no point did I claim superiority. I only asked the officer to check the documents, which he refused to do. The synergy of the board members' expressions told a story. Many seemed unconvinced by Kingsley's narrative. The leaked complaints, the body cam footage, and Carter's measured account formed a damning chorus. The hearing lasted hours, with testimonies from other officers, including Hughes's partner, who admitted feeling uneasy about the stop from the start. Finally, nearing the day's end, the board convened to deliberate. Outside, the crowd waited in tense anticipation. Carter emerged after giving his statement, quietly stepping past reporters. He sought refuge in a quiet hallway, feeling drained yet oddly resolute. He was about to leave the building when a voice called out behind him, "Judge Carter." It was Hughes, alone, tie askew, face drawn. He looked different without the uniform, younger, more vulnerable. Carter turned, his mind racing. What was there left to say? He studied the officer's face. The anger he'd felt for weeks began to ebb, replaced by a more complex swirl of pity and sadness. "Officer Hughes," Carter greeted stiffly, uncertain of the protocol in this moment. They weren't in a courtroom after all. Hughes seemed to struggle with his words. I'm sorry," he finally said, voice cracking. "I know it might not mean much now, but I didn't mean for it to go this far." Carter frowned. "Go this far?" he echoed. "You mean you didn't expect to get caught?" Hughes pressed his lips together. Tears threatened to form. "Maybe. I don't know. I was doing my job, or at least I thought I was. I didn't realize." "Didn't realize what?" Carter asked quietly, his voice carrying a note of genuine curiosity. "That you were someone important," Hughes mumbled, his gaze dropping. Carter bristled. He had hoped for a recognition that all citizens should be treated with respect, not just important ones. But the words caught in Hughes's throat indicated the real issue. The only reason this garnered so much attention was because Carter was a judge. For countless others, the outcome might have been a bleak footnote, overshadowed by bigger news. In that moment, Carter felt a wave of sorrow. He shook his head. "I'm not looking for an apology just because I'm a judge. I'd want you to understand that no one deserves what you did. It's not about me. It's about the principle." Hughes said nothing, just stood there. Whether his remorse was genuine or a last-ditch effort to salvage dignity, Carter couldn't tell. Maybe it was both. After a moment, Carter turned and left without another word, the echo of footsteps trailing down the corridor. A week later, the review board released its decision. Officer Hughes was found guilty of multiple counts of misconduct, including racial bias, excessive use of force, and insubordination for ignoring dispatch. The recommendation was immediate dismissal from the force and possible referral to the district attorney for criminal charges. The announcement rocked the city. Detroit Police Department leaders scrambled to assure the public that they would implement reforms. The union, despite its earlier posture, made a bland statement about disappointment in the verdict, but stopped short of championing Hughes's cause. The once confident policeman realized he was truly alone, abandoned by the institution he had so rigidly defended. As the swirl of reporters, lawyers, and activists centered on him, Hughes retreated from public view. He faced potential charges. His father, upon hearing the news, berated him for bringing disgrace to the family. Bills piled up as he lost his primary source of income, and the union wasn't keen on paying for a drawn-out legal fight that seemed unwinnable. Kingsley, sensing the futility, began negotiations for a plea bargain if the DA decided to press charges. The officer who once prowled Detroit's streets with a sense of power now found himself on the opposite end of the law's scrutiny. Meanwhile, Judge Carter was praised for his composure and for shining a light on systemic issues. He remained circumspect, neither gloating nor letting the victory overshadow the bigger picture. In private, he discussed with Michelle Grant and Harriet Daniels the next steps for broader reforms. The city was ripe for change, and they wanted to seize the moment to push for meaningful improvements like expanded community policing initiatives, oversight committees, and educational programs aimed at bridging the divide between law enforcement and residents. Hughes didn't disappear entirely. A local tabloid published photos of him looking disheveled outside a budget motel where he'd reportedly moved. Rumors circulated that he was battling depression, possibly substance abuse. While some reveled in his downfall, others felt uneasy about the spectacle of a life unraveling. Some even argued that the system needed to rehabilitate rogue officers rather than merely discard them. Carter heard these rumors through the grapevine. Part of him wrestled with empathy. He recalled that final conversation in the hallway, the haunted look in Hughes's eyes as he offered his hollow apology. Carter had seen real criminals display less remorse, but also recognized that Hughes was a product of an environment that condoned such behavior. Where did justice end and vengeance begin? Regardless, the wheels of fate turned, and for once, Carter felt the system had done something right, not just for him, but for the principle that equality under the law cannot be a mere slogan. Several months later, in a hearing separate from the department's review, the district attorney decided to pursue misdemeanor charges against Hughes for the excessive use of force, bolstered by the body cam footage and witness testimonies. A plea deal was reached. Hughes pled guilty to a lesser charge in exchange for community service and a commitment to attend bias retraining. It was a far cry from the felony some activists had hoped for, but it ensured a criminal record that would prevent him from working in law enforcement again. Judge Carter, from a distance, continued to monitor the case. He had no direct role in the criminal proceedings, but was kept informed by Michelle Grant, Upon hearing the plea agreement, Carter felt a mix of relief and a lingering sense that real justice wasn't simply about punishing one officer. True justice meant preventing the cycle from repeating. In the aftermath, Carter took a short leave from the bench, using his accumulated vacation time to reflect. He visited his parents' old neighborhood on Joy Road, where memories of aspiration and hardship intermingled. He spoke with local youths, sharing his story, not only the nights he'd spent studying by a flickering lamp, but also the recent confrontation with Officer Hughes. He emphasized the importance of resilience, activism, and channeling anger into constructive change. He also sat with Harriet Daniels and Michelle Grant, drafting a comprehensive plan to present to city officials a multifaceted approach to police reform that included expanded community liaison programs, improved training protocols, and a transparent complaint process. The plan referenced real data from the department, including average wait times for complaint resolutions, typical demographics for traffic stops, and prior successful reforms in cities like Camden, New Jersey. It was ambitious, but the moment felt right. Carter returned to the bench invigorated. The public saw him differently now, not just as a stoic arbiter of law, but as a man who had personally experienced the sting of injustice. His court sessions reflected a renewed empathy for those who stood before him. He remained firm in his rulings, but listened more intently, keenly aware that behind every defendant was a story that might intersect with systemic failures. Years later, people in Detroit would tell the story of that time a white police officer pulled over a black judge for driving his own car, and how it became the catalyst for meaningful reform. While the city's journey toward justice was far from over, the incident was remembered as a turning point, a moment when the spotlight revealed uncomfortable truths and compelled the city to inch closer to the ideals etched into its courthouses. Officer Hughes would fade into relative anonymity. Some said he moved away from Michigan altogether, haunted by the ghost of what he'd done and how quickly his life had unraveled. Others whispered he found menial work in a neighboring county, or that he sought therapy for his anger issues. Judge Carter occasionally wondered about the man who had once pinned him against his own Mercedes. Did Hughes ever truly learn from that night? Or did he simply resent the system that had finally held him accountable? In the end, Carter focused on the bigger picture. Racial profiling, prejudice, and the misuse of power were not new problems. But each confrontation, each well-publicized case, forced a measure of collective reckoning. And for Judge Carter, that reckoning was personal. He became a living testament to how quickly the comfortable veneer of authority can be stripped away, revealing how fragile justice can be if not fiercely protected. Thus, what began as a humiliating traffic stop evolved into a story of transformation, not just for one officer or one judge, but for an entire city searching its soul. A reminder that sometimes the darkest nights can illuminate the path to a better dawn. Thank you for joining us on this intense, dramatic journey of power, prejudice, and redemption. The story of Judge Carter and Officer Hughes shows how a single moment, one routine traffic stop, can reveal deep-seated biases and injustices while igniting a city-wide call for accountability. Through unexpected twists, revelations, and hard-hitting karma, we've witnessed a community on the brink of division come together to demand meaningful change. Even though one incident can't erase decades of systemic issues, it can become a spark for reform, reminding us that every individual, regardless of rank or status, deserves respect and fair treatment under the law. If you found this story impactful, please give the video a like, share it with friends and family, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that aim to enlighten, inspire, and spark conversations. Your support helps keep these important stories alive and the push for justice moving forward.